The CSS Box Model is used to assist in designing a web page. The first thing to recognize is that all CSS elements are laid out in a box. To see the actuality of this, let's go ahead and open YouTube in your favorite browser. Next, we're going to press F12 on our keyboard or right-click on the web page and select Inspect. This will open up the browser's development tools. Now, without getting too overwhelmed, we're only going to look at a very small section of the developer tools in this video. Once the developer tools is open, let's go ahead and select this arrow icon here in the top left corner of the dev tools. And if we hover over this icon, we can see it says pick an element from the page. Once we have selected that, we can hover over the various elements on this web page to see that indeed each element is contained within a box. Even the elements that appear to be a shape other than a square or a rectangle are contained within right angles or a box. With that in mind, let's go ahead and close the dev tools for now by clicking the close icon here. Alright, so now we know that all elements are laid out in boxes. And looking at a diagram of the box model, we can see that these boxes are made up of a few sections. Working from the inside out, we can see they are made up of a content box, a padding box, a border box, and a margin box. Let's look at HTML elements that have some styling applied to them. Let's first look at this H1 element. We can see that the width has been set to 200 pixels and the height has been set to 100 pixels. Also, the background color has been changed to blue to better see what's going on here. Now if we open up our developer tools again by pressing F12 and click on layout here, we can see a box model representation. Now if we click the arrow icon in the top left corner here and select the H1 element box, we can see the representation of the H1 box model right here. Notice we see the dimensions we set for the H1 element, a width of 200 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. This section would be the content box. Notice if we change the dimensions of this box in our CSS, the dimensions of this box model representation will also change. We also see the padding we assigned in our CSS is also represented here. We set the padding to 10 pixels and the box model verifies this. The same with the border and the margin that we have set. We set our border to have a width of 5 pixels shown here and the margin to be 15 pixels shown here. Now, we haven't covered padding, borders, or margin in this series yet, but they will follow this video, so don't be overwhelmed by the mentions of them. Just recognize that these are the values that make up the box model. As a brief explanation, let's take a detour and look at a framed picture to help see what each represents. Looking here, the picture would be the content box. The white space around the picture would be the padding. The frame would be the border, and the white space outside of the border would be the margin. So we know the box model is made up of 4 sections: the content box, the padding box, the border box, and the margin box. Now we set the width of the H1 element to be 200 pixels and the height to be 150 pixels, and we see that here. But if we click on the arrow here and hover over our H1 element, we see the dimensions 230 by 180. Why is that? That's because by default, the box sizing attribute of the H1 element is set to content box. If we add the box sizing rule to our CSS and change it to the only other option box sizing can be set to, border box, we can see a couple things change. First off, if we hover over the H1 element again, we can see the dimensions are equal to what we set them to in our CSS, 200 pixels by 150 pixels. The other thing that changes is the dimensions down here in the box model representation have changed. We see the content box is now at 170 pixels by 120 pixels. But if we add up the padding and border dimensions on all sides, we will get a total of 200 pixels by 150 pixels, the dimensions we set in our CSS. Let's set the box sizing back to the default content box again and see exactly what changed one more time. When set to content box, the content box alone equals the dimensions we set in our CSS. The padding and border are added onto these dimensions with this box sizing method. So the size of our H1 element box turns out to be 230 pixels by 180 pixels. That's 200 pixels of the content box plus the 10 pixels of padding on each side plus the 5 pixels of border on each side. Similarly, the height of the H1 box is the 150 pixels we set plus 10 pixels for both the top and bottom and 5 more pixels for both the top and bottom. This makes the total box size of our H1 element 230 pixels by 180 pixels. And setting the box sizing rule back to border box one more time, we see the box our content is in goes down to 170 pixels by 120 pixels to account for the additional size added by the padding and border, bringing the total size of the H1 element box to 200 pixels by 150 pixels. Once again, the size we assigned our h1 element to have in our CSS. So, with box sizing set to border box, padding and border are included in the width and height calculation of the element box size. With content box, padding and border are not included in the calculation and in turn make the box size of the styled element extend past the dimensions you may have assigned that element to have in your CSS. Now, not all elements have a default box sizing attribute of content box, and more often than not, using border box is the better option for all HTML elements when designing a web page, as content box may mislead your styling decisions. With that in mind, just like resetting margin and padding within the universal selector is always a good practice, setting box sizing to border box is also a good practice.